Thank you for inviting me, Connor.
Yeah, this is it's a real pleasure. I've been listening to and following along with your work for quite some time, and I've read a number of your books, and even attended an online meditation retreat because I couldn't be there in person, obviously because of COVID. But there's something about your teaching and the way in which you form your ideas or concepts around meditation that I feel almost physically within me. And so I'm very intrigued to have this conversation because it's out of all of the people, the teachers that I've listened to over the years. I mean, I've been exploring Buddhism and Zen and meditation for probably 12 to 15 years now. And there's something about the way in which you're able to articulate it that I feel points to the thing, points to awareness, the finger pointing to the moon in a way that allows me to comprehend it and experience it in a much more clear manner. And so first, I just wanted to thank you for that, because you've helped to shed light on something that I have been really exploring for a very long time. And your words really ring true for me. So that's my fanboy appreciation and gratitude before we begin.
Thank you for saying that, Connor. I'm very very happy to hear that.
Yeah, and then I have to ask you the question, which is, tell us a story about a defining moment in your life that made you who you are today, which is such an interesting question to pose to someone like yourself. So I'm looking forward to see what you have to say.
That's quite a question to start with. I could choose so many moments. Let's go all the way back to my early 20s. In fact, I must have been about 20. And I tell this story because it's particularly relevant for the subject matter of our talk. I was living and working in the southwest of England, training to be a potter in a very remote, almost a kind of Zen-like monastic circumstance. But I had a girlfriend, not living with me or even near me, so we very rarely saw each other. But we had been together for a few years, and in my innocence and naivety, I just presumed we were going to, have 4 children and live happily ever after. We'd been together for a few years, and I was very much in love. And one night she called and ended the relationship in a conversation that can't have lasted more than 2 minutes. We'd been together for about 3 years by this time. The bottom just fell out of my world completely. It was in a moment, or in a period of a couple of minutes, everything in which I had invested my happiness collapsed. And I realized, really, for the first time ever, although I had been interested in these matters for some time, I had been meditating and studying the classical Advaita Vedanta teaching for 3 or 4 years by this time. But this was the first time it became really clear to me in a visceral way, not just a sort of interesting intellectual way, but really in a visceral way, that I had invested my happiness in a person, that my happiness depended upon my relationship with this person and my projection into the future as to how my life was going to unfold with her. And it seemed so secure. It had never occurred to me that we would separate. And then in a couple of minutes, it just came to an end. And I really it became clear to me for the first time the extent to which I had invested my happiness in objective experience, in this case, a relationship. So really, for the first time in my life, this event precipitated the question in me, what is a reliable source of happiness? if any objective experience, in this case a relationship, but a job, one's finances, a house, a family, if any one's health, if any objective circumstance can disappear or come to an end at a moment's notice, what sense does it make to invest one's happiness in something so fragile, so fleeting, so insecure? And as I said, I had already been interested in these matters, but this event injected intensity into my spiritual search, which was really the search. What is the search for lasting happiness? Where can one find lasting happiness? What is the source of peace? So this event really, it profoundly shaped my life. My life really changed then. I was determined to find out, where can we find happiness?
So what was the answer to that? I mean, I feel like you have to give us the insight into that, because I think I would just say that, I've certainly been intrigued with that as well. I think part of my spiritual endeavor has been a pursuit of trying to understand that question as well. So how did that unfold?
Join the club. I think all 8 billion of us, if we were to ask everyone, I mean, literally everyone, not just those relative few of us that are interested in spiritual matters or non-duality, but literally everyone, what is it that you really want most of all in life? To begin with, most people would say an intimate relationship, a family, better health, a beautiful home, more money, and so on. But if we then asked, but why do you want these things? They would say, on account of the happiness that I believe will be derived from them. If we were to ask someone, okay, if you were to find that intimate relationship, but you knew that it would be a source of misery to you, would you still desire it? No, of course not. Even if the search for enlightenment, if one was told, okay, you can have enlightenment. If some magician said, I can give you enlightenment, but it will make you miserable, do you still want it? Well, of course we wouldn't. So the desire for happiness is even higher than the desire for enlightenment. In fact, we only desire enlightenment, or indeed whatever it is we desire, for the happiness we believe will be derived from it. What did I discover? I discovered really, and then now fast forward several years, I discovered really what all the great religious and spiritual traditions have been saying for centuries, indeed millennia, namely that happiness is the very nature of our being. And therefore, to find happiness, one need only know the nature of one's being. One need only know oneself as one essentially is. That's it. And after 20 years or so of exploring, it became my experience. I found out that this was true. The happiness that I had been seeking all along was simply the nature of my being. And it's available to everyone. And I mean everyone, not just those relative few of us interested in spiritual matters, but all 8 billion of us. It is not complicated. One does not have to become a Buddhist or a Christian, or one doesn't have to nor does one have to engage in elaborate practices. So I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with becoming a Buddhist or a Christian, but it's simple. The essential understanding that lies at the heart of all the great religious and spiritual traditions is simple. If you want lasting peace and happiness, you have to go into yourself and recognize the nature of yourself as you essentially are. Now, why don't we recognize that? But everybody, all 8 billion of us, we all have a sense of ourself. Everybody has the sense of being myself. So everybody knows their self to a degree, but not everybody knows their self clearly. And it is this lack of clear self-knowledge I would suggest, and all the great traditions suggest, that is responsible for the veiling of our innate peace and joy. And that is why self-knowledge is really lies at the center of all the great traditions. It's why the words "know thyself" are carved above the entrance of Apollo in Delphi. This understanding of the necessity to know oneself stands at the very foundation of Western civilization, and of course, in the East, there are many examples of it.
I'm hoping that you can elaborate a little bit more on the nature of the self, because I've heard you talk a little bit about this in a number of ways. You know, you in your book, The Nature of Consciousness, I believe that in some ways you're sort of talking about what the nature of the self is, and so maybe if you can just outline that a little bit more, not necessarily in sort of defining it, but to give the listener and myself a little bit more context for what is the true nature of us, what is the true nature of the self, and where does consciousness sort of fit into there, and how do you define consciousness? Because I think the mainstream materialist viewpoint of consciousness is that it's a byproduct of material, it's a byproduct of matter. And I think that from my understanding, there's sort of an opposing view that you hold, and I think a lot of spiritual teachings and religions actually hold, which is that consciousness is primary, consciousness is a priori in some ways. And so I'm hoping that you can maybe shed some light on that. I know I just sort of put out a few different components, so I'll let you sort of choose what pathway you would to go down.
You've made my job very easy, Connor. Yes, the essential nature of anything is the aspect of that thing that cannot be removed from it. So the essential nature of ourself is that aspect of ourself that remains behind when everything that is not essential to us is removed. And if we explore this experientially, not intellectually, but if we actually make an experiential exploration of what is our essential nature, removing everything that is superfluous to us, what we end up with is consciousness or awareness. For instance, our thoughts are obviously not essential to us. If a thought was essential to us, then every time a thought disappeared, we would feel that a little bit of us disappeared with it. But we don't feel that. The thoughts appear, they last for a while, they vanish. The thought doesn't actually add anything to us when it appears. It doesn't remove anything from us when it leaves. Likewise, our emotions, they may be very, very intimate, very intense, but they're not essential to us. We exist in the absence of any particular emotion. The same with perceptions, sensations, activities, relationships. So if we remove everything that is not essential to us, the one element of experience that we cannot remove experientially from ourselves is consciousness. That is our bottom line. It is our primary experience. It is not possible to have an experience of ourself, or indeed of anything, without consciousness. So consciousness is the prerequisite for any experience or knowledge. So consciousness is primary in our experience. And I would suggest it is the only element of our experience that remains consistent throughout all experience. For instance, again, let's make this practical and not just philosophical or intellectual. If I were to ask you now, are any of the thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, or perceptions that you are currently having the same as those that you were having, let's say, this time yesterday?
I don't think so, no.
Why the hesitation? Surely that your current thought, let's just call it thought and perception to keep the list short. Surely the current thought and perception that you are having now is different from
quite different.
It's different from the thought that and perception that you were having 2 minutes ago, 2 days ago, 2 years ago, when you were 20 years old, when you were 2 years old. Your thoughts and perceptions have changed innumerable times in your life. There's no constancy there. There's no continuity in objective experience. By objective experience, I mean thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions. Now, what about if I asked you the question, is the awareness that is aware of your current experience different from the awareness that was aware of your experience this time yesterday?
No, I don't think it is. Like, I feel like the awareness has been, and I think this is part of what has been somewhat illuminating about interacting with the way in which your meditation is taught in some ways, that it's, how do I say this? I've had the feeling of being in that sort of seat of awareness, and that has been there since, as far as I can
forever.
recall. Even as a child, like as a child, I experienced that, and it's such an interesting thing.
Connor, have you not always felt, I am myself? Mm-hmm. That you feel there is a continuity to your identity. You don't feel I'm one person one day and I'm James the next day and Harry the next day. And you always feel I'm essentially the same person or the same self now that I was yesterday, last year. And when I was a 2-year-old boy, do you not feel that you're essentially the same self as you were as a 2-year-old boy? Well, none of your thoughts, feelings, sensations, or perceptions are the same now as they were yesterday, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or when you were a 2-year-old boy. So none of your thoughts, feelings, sensations, or perceptions can account for your absolute certainty. I am the same self. So where does that sense of the continuity of your identity come from? There must be one element of your experience that is continuous. Otherwise, you would not have the sense of continuity. Now, what is that? What has remained continuous throughout your life?
Yeah, I mean, as far as I can tell, it's just the awareness of that experience.
Just the fact of being aware. Everything else comes and goes. So that being aware is like the screen, and all your thoughts, images, feelings, sensations, perceptions, and so on are like so many images or movies that play on the screen. But just as a movie requires a permanent background, so experience requires the continuity of awareness. And that, I would suggest, is our essential identity. Now, we can go further. If I were to ask you now, describe your thoughts or your perceptions or your feelings, your bodily sensations, you would describe their qualities, their features, there would be something objective there for you to describe. What if I were to ask you, and refer to your experience of being aware, not your ideas or what you've read in a book, but if you were to refer now to the simple fact of being aware, nothing mystical or spirit, just the ordinary, familiar feeling of being aware, how would you describe it?
It's almost like it really is. It's hard for me to put to language sometimes, but it's the experience of what is, and what is happening, and what I'm witnessing simultaneously.
What you are witnessing is what you awareness are aware of.
Yeah.
Now, if I ask you what you're witnessing, you can describe it easily. Oh, Rupert's wearing a blue shirt, or I'm feeling a little bit. But no, I'm asking you about that which is aware. of whatever you are witnessing.
It's the experience of the unchanging. I don't know if I can.
It's unchanging. Yes, it's ever present.
Yeah.
You're struggling to say anything about it, and quite rightly, Connor. It's an unkind question to ask you. You're right to struggle to say. If you were to ask me a question about it, I would also struggle to say something true about it. Why? Because there's nothing objective there that we can describe. It's not like a thought or a feeling or a sensation or a perception. It has no color or size or shape or taste or smell. So there's no language to describe it. In fact, your initial silence was in fact the most accurate thing you said about it. Now, having no objective qualities or features, how can we legitimately claim that it is temporary or finite or limited? We can't. The reason we think that our essential self is something temporary and finite and limited is because we have allowed ourselves to become mixed up with the content of experience. We have identified ourselves with the content of our thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, and so on. And this mixture of our self, unlimited awareness, with the qualities of experience produces an apparently temporary, finite, separate self or ego.
Okay, so I think I have a somewhat of a grasp on what you're alluding to, that consciousness is our primary experience, and that the ego, the objective experience, is sort of formed outside of that. And I guess this is sort of at the heart of the non-dual teaching, right? That there is no differentiation between awareness and what we are aware of, that all of that is simultaneously us. Like, how would you break that down? Because I think, is there a difference between this non-dual concept? And I believe that you're in the Vedanta tradition. Is there a difference between that and something like solipsism or panpsychism? And are these labels even necessary?
All right. I suggested earlier that the great understanding that is contained in all the great religious and spiritual teachings is this understanding that happiness is the nature of our being. That's one aspect of the non-dual understanding, and it relates to our internal experience. But there's a second aspect of the non-dual understanding which relates to our external experience, that is, our experience of the world. And it states essentially that what we essentially are and what the world essentially is are one. In other words, that consciousness is the ultimate reality of the universe. It is the ultimate reality of ourself, but it is also the ultimate reality of the universe that we perceive. So that although it appears from our limited perspective that reality is divided into two parts, a self and a world, mind and matter, in reality, this is just due to the limitations of our perceptual apparatus, and that in reality, reality is a single indivisible whole. Now, how does that relate to solipsism and panpsychism? So it's very different from solipsism. Solipsism states, only my own mind exists. So I'm sorry, Connor, you don't have a mind. You're not hearing anything now. You're not experiencing anything. You're just an image in my perceptual field. And none of your listeners, I'm afraid, from the point of view of none of them are really hearing this talk, because there are no other minds. There are no other selves. There is nobody else is having experience. Only I, only Rupert. That's what solipsism states. Rupert's mind is the only mind there is. Now, that is very, very different from the suggestion in the non-dual traditions, which is all reality is not contained in one single mind. It is contained in infinite consciousness. And that each of our minds is a localization of that infinite consciousness. So the non-dual understanding suggests that the universe appears in consciousness, but it exists and ultimately is made of consciousness, but it exists outside of and independent of its being perceived by any individual mind. Now, we can come back to that, explore that more, if you like, in a minute, because you asked how this related to both solipsism and panpsychism. Panpsychism is another idea which is very, very fashionable in philosophy of mind circles now, which is the idea basically that the universe is made up of particles, subatomic particles, whatever exactly those particles may be, and that each of these particles is conscious. So this again is very different from the non-dual understanding, which suggests that only consciousness is conscious. The idea of panpsychism is an extension of the primary mistake of materialism, namely that what we essentially are as a human being is a physical body, and that we as a physical body have an attribute of consciousness. In other words, that this body is conscious or has consciousness. Now, if we take that as the basic fact of our experience, we then reason, okay, well, dogs and cats also have consciousness. And that's corroborated by the fact that when you tread on your cat's tail, it screeches. Why? Because it is conscious of the pain. Oh, that makes sense. And we can do the same experiment with birds and fishes and even fleas and ants. They seem to have consciousness. They respond to their environment. So they must have at least a degree of consciousness. So reasoning in this way, we go on and on and on, and we end up at the end with the idea, well, okay, everything has a degree of consciousness, not just humans and dogs and cats and fishes and birds and ants and fleas, but everything, even subatomic particles, have a modicum of consciousness. And this is a way, this idea, the idea of panpsychism, is based on the belief it is I, this body, who has consciousness or is consciousness. That's the primary belief that defines materialism. So panpsychism is just an extension of our materialist paradigm. But it's a way in philosophy of mind circles that contemporary philosophers, are able to accommodate the idea that consciousness may be universal without giving up their materialist assumptions. Sooner or later, in fact, it's already happening. There are a number of philosophers now who realize that it's not matter that has consciousness. Consciousness is primary, and matter is what the activity of consciousness looks like from a localized perspective. So those are that's a brief response to your question about solipsism and panpsychism. We can, and how they're very different and often mistaken in the contemporary, in some spiritual circles and philosophy of mind circles, how they're mistaken for the non-dual understanding. So I'm happy to go into more detail if you like, but I don't want to go too deeply into it.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think that sort of answers my question, and it brings up, Krishnamurti talked extensively about the need or a sort of motion towards moving beyond our current traditional concept of time. And I'm curious about how you see time fitting into this movement towards, I don't know how else to say it, being in the seat of awareness. Because for me, I've had a sort of experience that the ego is caught within the finite, that the ego is the manifestation of all of these moments, and that the awareness is somehow maybe not transcendent of that, but exists in somewhat of a different playing field or plane. And I'm curious if you can speak to that. Like, where does time fit into this? Because even, you have quantum physicists like, I can't remember what his name is, Corelli. He's a very famous Italian quantum physicist, and he talks about, as we move, down into the subatomic levels of quantum mechanics, that time sort of begins to break down and ceases to exist, and that past and future are somewhat of an illusion in many ways. That they're entropic states that we can look back on. And I think what you're maybe talking about in some ways is that the experience that we have of awareness is maybe the only constant that we are. And I guess I think that's a good way of saying it. So I'll leave that heavily, that dense question at your doorstep, and and just see what you have to say about it. Because I think for me, in my meditations, I've experienced this sort of distinction that my ego is very wrapped in time. It's very obsessed with and consumed by the experience of time, and that outside of that experience, my awareness is the ever-present aspect of me and maybe of existence. And so I'm hoping that maybe you can just speak to that in some manner.
Yes. Well, again, I'd like to respond to you, Connor, experientially rather than philosophically. So, time, it's difficult, if not impossible, to define time without referring to time itself. We can say time is the duration between the past and the present, but that's just like saying time is the time between. But in order to think about time, we have to define it in some way. So let's agree that time is the space or the distance or the duration between a point in the past and now, or a point in the past and tomorrow morning, or tomorrow morning and tomorrow evening. So we can't make sense of time without, in some way, referring to the past and the future. So now, in your actual experience, have you ever left what we call now and visited that place we refer to as the past? Not thought about it. We can all think about it, but when we think about the past, our thought doesn't take place in the past. It takes place now. But have we ever actually experienced the place that we refer to as the past?
No.
Has anyone ever been there or experienced it? Could anyone ever experience it?
No, I don't think so.
Because if they had an experience of it, it would be, by definition, an experience that takes place now. But experiences, by definition, takes place now. Likewise, no one's ever had an experience of the future. Now, if nobody, none of the billions of people who have existed, if nobody has for a moment experienced a past or a future, could it be that our model of time is simply that, a model which is necessary for everyday life, but a model that doesn't accurately portray the nature of reality? Because surely, in order to build a model of reality, we must start with our experience. either we start with our experience or we start with an abstract model, but then we could choose any model at all. So if our models are going to be grounded in reality, they must start with something that is verifiable in our experience. And nobody has ever experienced a past or a future. And therefore, so let me ask you another question. You experience what we call now. We are all experiencing. We know what we mean when we say now. Now, is it your experience that now is a fleeting moment?
No.
Or is it your experience that now is ever present?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems somehow almost inextricably connected to awareness itself.
Exactly. If I were to ask you, kind of, how many moments of now have you experienced since we've been talking to each other? What would you say?
mean, like infinite. It's
No. It's not infinite moments. It's just one. It's just one experience. The now is always one. You haven't actually experienced infinite moments. You only experience infinite moments if you believe that time is that the now is a fraction of a second. Then, if our experience of the now was a fraction of a second, then indeed we would have experienced millions of them. But we're not experiencing millions of fractions of a second. No, it's just always now. And given that you've admitted I've never experienced the past or the future, can you really say that it is your experience that now is moving along a line of time, or is the now stationary?
Yeah, that's a little bit more challenging, but it would seem as though it's more of a stationary position.
It's stationary because we have no experience of a line of time between the past and the future through which the now could be moving. The experience of now is stationary. It's stable, and it is awareness, as you rightly observed. The now is the presence of awareness. It's not going anywhere. It hasn't come from somewhere. It is eternal, and by eternal I mean ever present, not everlasting. It is in a vertical dimension, not a horizontal dimension. However, when we think about that vertical dimension, the eternal now, thought refracts it and spreads out the eternal and makes it seem like the everlasting. So I would suggest that time is what consciousness looks like when it is refracted through thought. And just to give you something else to consider, we don't have time to go into it. I would suggest that space is what consciousness looks like when refracted through sense perception. In other words, time and space are not fundamental to reality. The reality is dimensionless consciousness. It only appears as time and space when refracted through the prismic activity of thinking and perceiving.
Well, that one is something I will go back and listen to and chew on, and because I feel like there is a quality of really profound truth in there that I think one of the things that I really appreciate is that you do bring things back to an experiential nature, and in a time where we are so riddled with and consumed by the addiction to thinking, which takes us out of experience, which takes us away, arguably further away from awareness itself, this nature of being that you're talking about, away from consciousness.
Yes.
I appreciate the sort of relentlessness of pulling things back to that experiential aspect and element.
Yes. Connor, I'm not against thinking, as you know. I like thinking. I think thought is a beautiful instrument, but I like to think. I like to build. If I want to build a model of reality with thoughts, I want to base it on something that is true in experience. Otherwise, we could just pluck any theory. If we do not demand that our models of reality are grounded in experience, then any theory will do. So I love thinking, but thinking, in my opinion, should serve experience and come from experience, and actually lead us to our actual experience. Because most of us, our experience is filtered through the overlay of conceptual thought. So we don't really experience reality as it is. We experience reality as it is filtered through our faculties of thinking and perceiving. So the purpose of thinking, at least in this context, in the context that we're speaking, would be to probe deeply into what is true of our experience and to help us to experience reality in a way that is true. And then the primary, the fundamental fact about reality, I would suggest, is that it is one. That there is one infinite, indivisible reality, and all people, all animals, and all things derive their apparently independent existence from that single reality. In other words, we are one.
Beautiful.
Take what's going on in the world today, politically, socially, ecologically. All the challenges, or many of the challenges we face, are brought about by human activity, which is based upon the belief that we are separate. We are separate from one another. We are separate from animals, and we are separate from the earth. And as soon as we believe we are separate from another person, another animal, or the environment, we can treat that person or that environment in a way that has no consequences for ourselves, because they are separate from us. Cruelty, unkindness, exploitation, injustice, all these, violence, hatred, all these are only possible if we think the other is other. As soon as we have this felt understanding that the other is really myself, the universe is myself, all animals are myself, that understanding alone compels us to act and behave in a certain way. So this understanding has profound implications for our society, for us individually, but also in terms of our internal happiness, but also in terms of our relationships with each other and with nature.
Well said. And I feel like what you're saying and the sort of map of meaning or how we structure reality, as you're saying, that vantage point, the way in which we structure reality then dictates how we interact with it.
Absolutely.
And so if we're othering other people, right? I think I don't remember where I heard this, but it was something about how the most damaging myth that we have is the myth of separation.
Yes.
And that as a human species, that when we allow that myth of separation to become a sort of cornerstone of our belief systems and how we operate, that it's somewhat catastrophic. And so I believe that what you're saying is that myth is exactly that. It's a myth.
It's exactly, Connor. One, it is a myth, and the consequences of this myth, the consequences of the paradigm of materialism, are the inevitable consequences are are twofold. One, unhappiness on the inside, and two, conflict on the outside. Conflict with between people and animals, and the exploitation and degradation of the earth. These are the inevitable consequences of the materialistic paradigm, the paradigm of separation. Unhappiness on the inside, conflict on the outside. And by contrast, the inevitable consequence of the non-dual understanding is peace and happiness on the inside, and love and beauty on the outside. But by love and beauty, I mean the recognition that we are one, that we share our being with everyone and everything.
And it is in some ways our work, our challenge, our confrontation to, and this is just my experience, like to move back towards that version of reality, that non-dual version of reality, where there is no other, because it is so easy to create that objectification, to objectify someone who believes differently or thinks differently, et cetera. And so, I know that we're close on time here, and I feel like I could selfishly speak with you for an entire day and not come away without more questions and comments. And I really love this dialogue. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to that, because I hear you sort of saying that this practice, and I'm actually going to bring one of your own quotes into the fray here, and I'll just let you wrap up as you see fit. But in the meditation retreat that I took part in with you, you said prayer is an act of returning to the empty sanctuary of the heart. And there was something about that, almost invitation, that felt so potent for our current time, where we have become a culture that is just drenched in separation and mired by our propensity to objectify other people.
Yes.
And so I'm hoping that you can just speak to how we move more directly towards not the elimination of that objectification, but the return to our natural being, as we started off this conversation discussing.
Yes. Prayer is this movement, this return to the empty sanctuary of the heart, prayer or meditation or contemplation. By the empty sanctuary of the heart, I mean our naked, uncolored being, just the fact of being aware. Before our being is colored or qualified or conditioned by experience, just naked, self-aware being. And that experience, that non-objective experience, is the same for everyone. Everyone's thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions are different, but the fact of being aware is identical for everyone. And it is our essential nature. And it shares none of the limited qualities of objective experience. There is no sense of lack in it, and thus its nature is joy. There is no agitation in it, thus its nature is peace. And I would suggest that it is that we as individuals emerge out of the universe. So the fundamental nature of ourself must be the same as the fundamental nature of the universe, for the same reason that the nature of the wave is the same as the nature of the ocean. So the essential nature of what we are, just infinite self-aware being, is, I would suggest, the same as the nature of the universe. So this recognition, that this return to the empty sanctuary of the heart, we return to our naked being, and we first discover its nature as peace and joy, the peace that passeth all understanding. But then the more deeply we go into it, we realize that this being is the being that we share with everyone and everything. And this takes us out of the privacy of our own heart, out into the world. And we realize that the being we are is shared with everyone. And that the recognition of our shared being is the experience of love or beauty. So these two aspects, the inner recognition of our being as peace and happiness, and the recognition that we share our being with everyone and everything, the experience of love or beauty, these are the two hallmarks, really, of the non-dual understanding. And you talked just a few minutes ago about purpose. And I would say that one's purpose could be framed in reference to these two essential understandings, an inner purpose where our purpose is to rediscover our essential being and its innate joy. That is everybody's inner purpose, to return to the empty sanctuary of the heart, to recognize or to know again their own being with its innate peace and joy. But then we also have a purpose which relates to the second aspect of the non-dual understanding, namely that we share our being with everyone and everything. And that second aspect would be the second purpose, our outer purpose, so to speak, would be to bring this understanding out into the world, to share it in the world in some way. And it might be what I'm doing, speaking and writing, and it might be what you're doing, holding interviews and podcasts. And there are numerous other ways where this understanding can be communicated in the world. So I think these are the two tasks: to discover the nature of our own being, and then to share that discovery in one way or another with humanity.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, and thank you for your contribution, and thank you for being on the show, and just for your voice and in being able to articulate something and sort of point towards something that I feel is so fundamentally important within our current time. Terence McKenna at one point in his life talked about an archaic revolution, that in order to solve some of the problems that we face in our current space, we have to reach very far back into the past, be able to return to a sense of ancient understanding.
Yeah, very far back into the past, which really translated in our language means very deeply into oneself.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Yes. Okay, we're going to have to pause there. And I truly do hope that you come back on the show at some point, because there's just a list of questions that I didn't get to, and I enjoy your presence in conversations. So there's a selfish component to that as well.
I'd be very,
but for everyone that is out there, you can go and check out some of Rupert's work. Rupert, where would you like them to engage with you? What's the easiest route? Just your website?
Two places, really. YouTube, that there are an embarrassing number of YouTube videos. I can't remember 200, 300, 400. So that's the easiest way, just to get a quick sample. And then if you want to explore more deeply, go to my website, rupertspira.com.
Yeah, and I would, for everyone that's out there, recommend reading one of Rupert's books. I really enjoy The Nature of Consciousness, but I believe that you have one coming out soon.
The Nature of Consciousness is it's quite a commitment to read that. I would, for most people, at least beginning, unless they're very philosophically minded, in which case The Nature of Consciousness would be fine. But I would perhaps recommend Being Aware of Being Aware. It's shorter. It's based on meditations. It's very experiential, and a new book which is coming out any minute called Being Myself. So yes, The Nature of Consciousness, Being Aware of Being Aware, or Being Myself.
Wonderful. And we'll have links to all that in the show notes. For everyone that's out there who enjoyed this conversation, certainly share it with someone that you know will enjoy it, and that you know will appreciate engaging in this dialogue and process. And so until next week, this is Connor Beaton signing off. Rupert, thank you again for joining me. And
thank you, Connor. It's been a pleasure talking with you.